I see public relations as the lens that provides the corrective perspective in two directions.
The challenge in PR is to try and influence an editorial community which is seeking legitimate news value.
Oftentimes the first time that a client will get public relations counseling is when something bad happens to them.
From the earliest times, leaders have been concerned about their public image. In the past century or so, mass media have helped mold those perceptions and misperceptions 1,000-fold. Today, the masters of communication understand the power of mass media and their ability to inform and persuade.
Friends die from drinking, and drinking and driving can kill a friendship.
Public relations happen any time an individual or an institution wants to influence public attitudes, and that's always. So we, who are consumers, who are voters, who are citizens, are on the receiving end of a lot of attempts to influence the way we see the world. And those attempts, generally, are exercised upon us by public relations practitioners.
It's how organizations communicate with their publics. So really, public relations should probably be called publics relationships, because it's how an organization relates to its different publics, beginning with its own employees and then working outward, let's say, to all of the people who, in today's parlance, are known as stakeholders in an organization.
The Kodak Advantix film cassette is truly the heart, soul, and the mind of this new system.
The history of public relations really goes back to the dawn of civilization, because public relations is fundamentally any time someone is an intermediary between the people who want to be better known and understood and the people who they believe ought to better know them and understand them.
If you think historically, way back historically, that the Gospels in biblical time were an example of how the good, so-called good news was spread about Christianity. And it's classic. It spread a religion as fast as anything could be spread.
Cicero tells us that the first people who practiced what we would recognize as public relations were two fellows in the 5th century of BC, Greece, named Corax and Tisias, on the Greek island of Syracuse, which is now Sicily. Corax and Tisias went into business after a revolution when tyrants had seized property. And after the tyrants were thrown out, they set themselves up to help people who wanted to get their property back. So they helped them in a couple of ways. One, they wrote speeches for them. Number two, they spoke on their behalf to the people in power. And number three, they wrote manuals on how to answer difficult questions in order to get your property back. Well, if you look at those three functions, those are three of the classic functions that anyone practicing public relations today would know.
Even in the early history of the United States, public relations was instrumental in shaping the colonialist opinion toward Mother England.
The committees of correspondence in the American Revolution were essentially public relations cells intended to get the word out about independence and to rally public opinion about the coming revolution.
The classic campaign that was waged by propagandists to get the colonists to believe that they should be separated from Great Britain. I mean, that was a long 20, 25, 30-year campaign of the propagandists, continually using events like the Boston Tea Party. Those were events that were exploited to give a drama and heightened attention to the situation, and were used to convince the colonists that the revolution was inevitable.
The Federalist Papers, which were themselves published in newspapers as editorials eliciting people to support the new Constitution and the Bill of Rights to the Constitution subsequently were themselves recognizable to anybody in public relations today as part of the classic public relations function.
The spread of mass circulation newspapers and wired communication in the 19th century began to heighten the need for good public relations in molding public opinion.
Now, as mass communication grew up, it became possible then to publicize, to get information out to the public, and you needed people to do that. So that was the rise of the so-called publicist, or the information specialist.
The railroads were the first companies to hire independent counselors to help with public relations and stave off unwanted regulation from the newly formed Interstate Commerce Commission. Among the earliest of these counselors to establish a public relations agency was Ivy Lee. He wrote a declaration of principles of what the field of public relations should be. Straight talk and honest representations were at the core of his ideals. During World War I, President Woodrow Wilson recognized the importance of influencing public opinion by forming the Committee on Public Information. On this committee was Edward Bernays, a pioneer of public relations who realized that if the public could be sold on war, they could be sold on anything.
Edward L. Bernays happens to be a personal hero of mine, although I've never met the man, is considered to be the father of modern public relations. He was the first person who called himself a public relations counselor, and he essentially revolutionized the way that people thought about influencing public opinion. He wrote a book back in 1923 called Crystallizing Public Opinion, which became one of the touchstones of contemporary public relations.
In fact, Edward Bernays was the first person to coin the term public relations counsel, meaning a person who advised other people on how to develop their relationships with different publics. He is important for a number of reasons, though, in that he did develop quite a few of the techniques of public relations that are still used today. For example, he was one of the first to apply psychological principles to public relations tactics.
Bernays' definition of public relations was the following. Public relations is the vocation of the social scientist who advises clients on the actions to take in order to influence public attitudes. Now, nowhere in there does he talk about the press, nowhere in there does he talk about communications, because what public relations is, at its essential, what we do best is act as a kind of applied anthropologist. What we do is we study very carefully the social and power relationships within groups and among groups, and then we advise our clients on the actions to take to influence those relationships in order to achieve desired outcomes. Now, Bernays was a master of that.
Bernays' first major public relations campaign was for the tobacco industry, which was seeking to change public opinion and open new markets.
One of Edward Bernays' most famous PR programs that he ever conducted was for American Tobacco, for Lucky cigarettes. And what he was trying to do is make it possible for women to smoke in public. At that time, which was the 1920s, it was very common for women to smoke, but not in public.
Bernays recognized that it was not enough to communicate to women, buy our cigarettes, because there was a category problem. The category problem was women were not comfortable smoking in public, and society was not comfortable having women smoke in public. So Bernays did something quite extraordinary. He said, okay, if the women smoking is a problem, let's change society and make it fashionable. So he found ways to have glamorous people photographed with cigarettes in their hands, smoking, and pretty soon, if you wanted to be seen to be de rigueur, you were seen holding a cigarette in your hand.
During World War II, public relations was once again marshaled as a tool of mass communication.
World War II was another extremely important period for the growth of public relations. There was again a federal agency that was built specifically for the purpose of spreading public information, and this was the Office of War Information.
Government public relations often avoided outright propaganda and focused on news and information about the war. Hollywood participated in the effort by producing fact-filled but stirring documentaries.
I I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
There was Ronald Reagan filming movies about the war effort. There was Bing Crosby singing "Bye, Bye, Bye, Buy a Bond." That was public relations intended to mobilize American public support for the war in Europe and Asia.
Since World War II, public relations has flourished as a tool for shaping the attitudes and behaviors of the public.
The largest single employer in public relations is the government. There are more public relations, public information, public affairs people in the federal and state and local governments than anywhere else. And that's a critically important function. When government works on the consent of the public, government spends a lot of time trying to educate, inform, and persuade the public to what it needs, wants them to know or needs them to know. So at the government level, there's a huge infrastructure of public relations. At another level, there's what is generally in the industry seen as the client side, or the inside job of public relations, and that's within corporations, within academic institutions, within not-for-profits, churches, advocacy groups. Just about every corporation in the country has a formal public relations function, whether they call it that or not. And finally, there are firms that specialize in providing for a fee public relations advisory and implementation services, and that's the public relations industry we tend to focus on.
As public relations grew as a field in all sectors of the economy, a standardized method developed for organizing a public relations campaign, beginning with research.
During the research phase, the practitioner will conduct research on every angle about the client, the product, or the service, or whatever it is that they offer, the problems that they're having, what needs to be done to build a better relationship between the organization and its publics.
What I think is a major trend in the public relations industry now is to take a step back and be more of a strategic consultant and to try and find out, you know, the best context within which to present that message, do the research you need to find out what the attitudes of your audiences are toward that topic, toward the company you're representing, toward the product or the service or the result that you're announcing.
Public relations campaign is intended to influence public attitudes and behavior in particular ways. So the starting point is always understanding what the change is that you want to affect in the marketplace, and then what the best way is to affect that change. So there's always a very aggressive research component to understanding what you're trying to accomplish and how you can best accomplish it.
Typically, you would want to find out as much about a client's business as possible, the industry that it operates in, the competitive environment, who its customers are, what particular concerns employees might have, you know, really identifying its different audiences. Stockholders are another one if it's a publicly traded company, and then find out what the concerns of those audiences are through research techniques, and put together a program to help the company communicate as effectively as possible the key messages it has to those audiences.
We've taken strides above and beyond everybody else in areas of ease of use, including Acer Computer Explorer software and Ubi, which is the out-of-box experience that allows people to be up and running in 5 minutes.
In formulating the action plan, public relations practitioners rely on certain tools of the trade for conveying their messages.
When you get down to crafting the traditionally understood public relations campaign, which is what do we say, how do we say it, to whom do we say it, the elements can include everything from writing materials intended for publication in newspapers to putting individuals, corporate executives, celebrities, whomever, in front of reporters on television, on the radio, to producing brochures or booklets, to holding special events, marathons, what have you.
Some of the common elements are press kits that would contain, say, a press release, for instance, that would talk about a newsworthy development at a client, whether it be the launch of a new product, a new development in terms of the company's financial structure, or its financial results, for instance, and some background information about the company itself. If you have a spokesperson who's delivering that message, typically you'd want some background about that person as well included. And if possible, some kind of information to put it in the context of the competitive environment that the company's dealing in.
Among the many public relations tools, the press release is one of the oldest and perhaps the most commonly used.
Ivy Lee originated the idea of having a handout, which is what we would call a press release today. And all he did was write down a statement, what his client wanted the press to know, just typed it up and handed it out to them.
So essentially, it's a way of easing the burden for reporters who choose to cover a particular story by providing them in what is hopefully journalistically approvable form material to include in the stories. Now, the news release has evolved so that now there are equivalents of the news release for television, for radio, and for the alternative media.
If you or your child is affected by 8 or more ear infections, 2 or more sinus infections...
There are a whole range of other types of tools that we would use as well. For broadcast outlets, we would typically try and provide broadcast quality videotape, which is called B-roll, which can be used to be interspersed with videotape that that organization might shoot itself, or interview footage that it might conduct.
Motown's influenced my whole life and how I've molded my career. The inspiration from the music to the dancing.
But whether it's a video news release or a radio news release or a picture news release, we also send photographs out to the world and give them permission to publish them without attribution. Whatever the medium is, the press release is essentially a handout that reporters are allowed, but not required nor forbidden, to incorporate into their own original news story.
Frank Carney, the co-founder of Pizza Hut, has found a better pizza at another company.
Public relations tools can also include advertising, or can be part of a paid advertising campaign, but usually they're seen as distinct activities.
We like to think that public relations, one of the big distinctions from advertising is that it has an added element of credibility to it, in that it's not paid. You have to pass a fairly rigorous test usually with most media outlets in terms of the news value of the information you're conveying and the credibility of that information.
Essentially, advertising is defined as buying time and space and having complete control of what is printed or spoken or viewed in that time and space. Public relations is more broadly defined as any endeavor intended to influence public attitudes, or more narrowly defined as persuading people to give you time and space over which you don't necessarily have control, but which, if you succeed, will be at least as powerful, if not more powerful, in persuading those who read it or see it that your message is one that has merit and that they ought to pay attention to. Now, advertising can be part of a public relations campaign, and it often is, and both advertising and public relations can be part of a broader campaign.
The way that you can tell whether an ad is public relations oriented or advertising oriented is by looking at the final purpose of the ad. If the ad is trying to sell a product or a service, then it's just plain old marketing trying to get you to buy the product. If the ad is promoting some other aspect, such as see what a good company we are, corporate image type of thing, then it's part of a public relations program.
One area where public relations and advertising is very different is that when you pay for an ad, that's what appears. The challenge in PR is to try and influence an editorial community which is seeking legitimate news value, which is cynical and skeptical very often of approaches from companies and their agencies, and that's their job. So you have to try and work through that filter and deliver a message which includes the key components that the client is trying to convey, and is also, and then that takeaway is one that's positive about the client.
While most public relations campaigns are carefully planned and executed in a fairly routine manner, it is when a crisis occurs that public relations truly becomes critical.
There are obviously high-profile examples of crises that companies face that can make or break them, and some that people are familiar with, like the Tylenol product tampering scare, or when Perrier found benzene in its springs and in its products. And those companies face some very difficult challenges, and we're able to overcome them.
Oftentimes, the first time that a client will get public relations counseling is when something bad happens to them. They are going along, everything's fine, and they feel they don't need PR. But then suddenly some crisis comes up and they need help responding.
Brown & Williamson is very pleased with the decision today by the federal court in North Carolina. We won today on the major commercial issue, which was our right to freely advertise and promote our products to adult consumers.
A crisis situation is one that often comes up for companies and for which they're not prepared. And one of the distinct disciplines of a public relations consultancy such as ours is a crisis communications capability. And the only way to effectively plan and manage for those types of events, because you never know when they're coming, is to really do a lot of preparation for them.
If you look at the classic academically identified exercise in the way not to handle a crisis, everyone points to the Exxon Valdez wreck off the coast of Alaska. And what happened there is this problem was out there. It was simmering. It was being handled at a low level of the corporation. And it wasn't until some week or 10 days after the fact, when there had been 10 days of coverage of birds and sea mammals covered in oil, dying and dead on the beaches, with people cutting up their Exxon credit cards on television and refusing to go to Exxon gas stations, that the corporate levels of Exxon finally recognized they had a need to mobilize public relations.
How do you turn that negative situation into an opportunity? I think you find ways that you can reach out to the public and say, first of all, we are sorry, we're acting as swiftly as we can to rectify this situation, and then we move on. We move on to rectifying it and then finding ways that we can improve our relationship.
The best situation is where you are proactively going after media coverage for your client. Very often you're reacting to a negative development or a crisis, and whether it pertains specifically to your client or to the industry as a whole, one of the takeaways on results is the balance between the positive and negative coverage that the client got. And the reality is what we really seek for them is accurate coverage.
Public service announcements are one way that some organizations have found to broaden their public relations effectiveness. Generally, PSAs help get the word out on behalf of public service, not-for-profit, healthcare, or safety causes.
Buckle that, buckle that, buckle that belt. Just one thing to say, and we know we're not wrong. When you go for a ride, put your safety belt on.
Public service announcements are a part of public relations, and it doesn't really matter what the cause is.
You chose to ignore the flashing signal. This is the next 60 seconds of your life.
The public service announcements that are on now have to do with underage drinking, have to do with underage violence, have to do with safe sex. In previous decades, public service announcements had to do with prenatal nutrition, had to do with fundraising for diseases, recognizing your symptoms of certain diseases, the kinds of things that generally don't have a lot of money behind them, but which are critically important to get out. And as a public service, broadcast entities, as part of their licensing process, agree to air a certain number of those in the course of a program cycle.
Ads such as these produced by the Ad Council, a not-for-profit organization sponsored by the advertising industry, help increase public awareness of critical issues that affect their lives, as well as build goodwill toward advertising in general.
It says each year 60,000 men and women die of colon cancer. But it's 90% curable if treated early. Maybe we should get a checkup.
Honey, I have more important things to worry about right now.
Whether the objective is damage control or building goodwill, public relations seeks to unobtrusively capitalize on mass media's ability to influence attitudes and change public behaviors.
What we really do now is not just deliver media coverage or ink or broadcast footage pertaining to a product launch or pertaining to the success of a mature product, moving it off the shelves. It's really helping companies or other institutions manage their reputation and communicate as effectively as they can to an ever wider range of publics who are becoming ever more sophisticated.
I see public relations as the lens that provides the corrective perspective in two directions. We correct the perspective of the organization as it looks out into the world, and we help it understand what the world wants and needs. And we correct the world's perspective on the corporation, and we help it understand what is good and positive and promoting about the corporation out into the world. So we're really advocates in two directions.
The ideal of public relations is symmetrical and will be symmetrical. And it's based on the concept, the communication concept of feedback. I want to know what you think, not to be able to dupe you with what I know that you think, but using what you think to help me adjust and say, okay, you've got a point, let's do it this way. Together, we can make it work.
Essentially, as the medium has changed, public relations has evolved to allow those who need to be better understood and who want to get their message out to be better understood and get their message out. In classical Greece, it was an oral society. The public relations function was essentially oral. In revolutionary America, where there were newspapers and leaflets and pamphlets, the public relations function congregated around there. In the early part of this century, public relations became very active in the newspapers and wire services, radio and television, and now, of course, everybody's talking about the internet. Every company wants to have a homepage. Every company wants to be able instantly to hook up satellite conferences with their employees in the field. So public relations is evolving to capitalize on the new technology, but that's nothing new. That's been the case since the 5th century BC.